Hello, everybody. I wanted to speak today about swedengate, and I hate that there is a term for it, but at least you know what I'm talking about. But these are the like talking about Swedish culture, and you know, one of the things mentioned was like, well, friends, kids, when they have friends over, do they, uh, get to share the dinner? Which usually not, at least when I grew up. So let me explain. Like I live in Sweden all my life basically, and study also a lot of Swedish history um, by myself though. But so I want to speak about where did this come from, and it also involves like more general Swedish history and also Swedish identity. I guess it touches on it, but there is like different. Sweden has been very different in different ages, and I don't think a lot of Swedes are actually always aware of all the history and what the implications have been of different historical events. Now, I don't, and I have to just say this so-called Swedengate thing to begin with. I have to say it's like so out of proportions. It's just like from a odd, peculiar thing. If you come from another country that you notice, and this is uh, when speaking to people from other countries, and do you do this now? And you realize, oh, most people don't do that. Like most people would have their. But let me talk about Swedish history, because actually Swedish history is different, and I don't think there was like actually like a conscious thing behind that. It's just how things evolve sometimes. Like Sweden is known as one of the richest countries in the world, but it wasn't always the case. In fact, most of its history, it was one of the poorest countries, very poor, and this is also especially when in the early, like really far back, like when there was glaciers, because the land was covered by glacier and it wasn't even inhabitable. But slowly, the glaciers melted after the global flood, and people started moving in, but it was very harsh conditions. Um, and this is like through most of Sweden and Scandinavian history. It's it's it was I guess in the beginning, during glaciers, you couldn't even farm. It was just hunting, and then later on when the glaciers melt, then you could farm it, but still was very difficult. This is before fertilizers. So but then you hear, so you had to do it exactly correctly. Farming is very sensitive, like, so that's why the really old Swedish culture was very hierarchical, and because uh, so you had, for example, the king and the region and the local regent, and then you had God, then you had the king, then you had the local regents, and then you had your parents. So it was, you had to uh, swear to obey those and these kind of things. And this kind of hierarchical thing was even in the local society. So even inside of the local society was hierarchies. Inside a farm there were hierarchies, which wasn't very much. It wasn't, but the difference is like, okay, you hear about a lot of countries, they have hierarchy, they have like authoritarian, but it wasn't. And many of those countries have like they enforce it through violence. It's like associated with violence, but I wouldn't say that the hierarchy that was in ancient Sweden or old Sweden, it wasn't enforced by violence. In fact, it was just for survival. It was necessarily for survival because the conditions were so harsh. That, I mean, if a boy who works on a farm, if he doesn't follow the instructions, he could mess up the whole farm, and then they would have nothing to live off for that year, and could basically die, or just yeah, it would threaten their survival. So it was very important that everyone contributed and everyone did their part. So you can make a metaphor almost like if you have astronauts who settle on the moon or wherever, it's very super critical for everyone to follow protocol for for the survival of that colony. Um, so it wasn't something that was needed so much to be enforced by force, because, well, if you didn't like it, you could just, there was no option. You can't work. It's not like there was like a flexible workforce, or you can just go somewhere else. I mean, you would just starve if you leave your farm. So, but later on there was the social democrats. So in the end of the old era, there was also, in that era, there was abuse, and they had like, you can call it slaves, uh, so, or servants, serfdom, maybe, I don't know. And there was like abuse. There was a lot. It wasn't as nice place to live in as it is today. So, and that's why like millions of Swedes moved out, like, and have, migrated to many different countries. And back in those days, I think there was maybe Sweden was the country with the most migrants moving out from it. I mean, to America, to different parts of Europe, even. And the reality is that Swedish blood, you can find it all over the world, basically. But then came, because it was not so easy to live in. But then came the Social Democrats, and before that there was the Enlightenment philosophy started to come, and they started to move away from the old hierarchy with the king and God on top, and moving more to secularism. And also the Social Democrats came, and one thing they instilled was everyone's equal value. So, and these are the values that people associate with Swedes today, and that today Swedes associate with themselves. But before that, there was a lot of people migrating to other countries. Maybe that's also why Sweden accepted many migrants to Sweden later on. But even though the culture was changed by the Social Democrats, there are still remnants from the old Sweden, the hierarchical Sweden, the Sweden that was went through famine and had when the people were just fighting to survive. And in those when there was like farmers, and each farm barely had enough to feed the people on their own farm, and therefore it was very much like rational. So I think this is just a unintended remnant from that era, that okay, now when you have your friend over. But even when they left the farming, there was poverty even in the industrial era, and the depression and all those days. It's so the real economic boom, I don't know when it happened to Sweden. I don't know if it started after the Second World War. That's when the economics in Sweden took an upturn, and one of those involved in that was the Eva Kruger, who built the financial empire, which of course helped Sweden and make business with other countries, but of course others before him as well. But he modernized the finance of the Sweden. But still, I mean, even though the Social Democrats, as socialists usually do, they do like the cultural purge and try to remove, all the remnants of the old ways, which they did in terms of, the Social Democrats instilled that everyone has equal value. But this is a remnant from the days of poverty, when the food was rationalized, so each family has their rations, and so and also it was also, I think, had to do with the there was the core family was very important, so everyone was supposed to eat dinner with their family, so because even in the industrial era, people would go to work, and because in the farm you see each other all the time. But if you work in industry and you go to a factory, and then you lose the connection. So dinner became very important, because that's the time for the family to meet each other. And this is, of course, even today in many countries. So, but even more in the, but also the fact from the difficult times, which, I mean, it wasn't. It was maybe less than 100 years ago that that Sweden came maybe out of poverty. So, and it's not something ill-intended, and I don't think anyone felt that it was ill-intended, even though you might wonder, but because it's if you see because people from other cultures don't do that, but it's just a remnant, like culture often is like remnants of days past, and how things had to be done once upon a time, even though today, I mean, there's no Sweden is one of the richest countries in the world, and they don't have any. There's no economic reason for that, you know. So that's my take on it.